You're listening to Up an Octave, a podcast by Sonivia, the podcasting agency that believes that women and non-binary people deserve to take up space in the podcasting industry because our thoughts, voices, and stories matter. Here you'll learn how to make dope podcasts that inspire, educate, convert, and most importantly, make your voice shine. I'm your host, Ruth Spence, and I'm here to take podcasting up an octave. Let's get into it. Hello, and welcome back to Up an Octave. I'm back. I needed a couple weeks to honestly just kind of regroup and reflect on the kind of content that feels important for me to make after the results of the presidential election here in the United States. I've also decided, I came back from this summer and I was like, we're going to be a little more loose with things. In the wake of what we're seeing right now, my HVAC system's on right now. My kid's eating an apple in the living room. I'm doing a load of laundry because toddlers are horrifyingly gross. And no one's going to die. It's going to be okay. This is what real life sounds like. And bestie, we are here sitting cozied up on the couch talking podcasts. If you are one of the many people that I've talked to recently who's like, I feel so much more inspired to action than I have maybe ever or maybe in a really long time, that this time has put a lot of people's feet to the fire in ways that are honestly kind of exciting. And I do say that from a place of privilege, because things are probably going to get pretty bad for a while. And that is something that is hard to sit with and hard to reconcile. But in the wake of some of the most disparate times is often in history when we have seen almost like a slingshot of action, that as we are pulled back from progress, we are able to spring forward and create more change than would have been otherwise available to us. Now, I say that obviously with the caveat that there are people who really, really, really need support right now, and that we are going to have to keep looking out for, and we're going to have to keep protecting. This is not going to be sunshine and rainbows for a good many people. So yeah, because of all that, releasing the lighthearted content about, here's how to make editing fun just hasn't felt on tone with the way that I'm actually feeling. And in this season of really embracing authenticity and vulnerability and transparency, those are some of the big words that I'm going to be taking with me into 2025. It just didn't feel right to put that out. I have been having so many conversations with people who I love, who are feeling honestly terrified for what their future holds. And it just made my skin crawl to think about releasing content that I'd recorded months ago in a very different headspace in these weeks. So if you are someone who is here for that type of content, if maybe you have just started a podcast with the inspiration of these current events, feel free to check my back catalog. Feel free to ask me questions in my DMs on Instagram, hang out with me on Threads. That content will come back, and my work is not necessarily changing, but the way that I approach what I do is shifting because of what feels valuable to me right now. So when we talk about podcasting as activism, I think that there are a few different schools of thought, and I don't believe that any of them are inherently right or wrong. But the way that I approach things is that even if you are a lighthearted comedy podcast, or, you talk about something that's like very tunneled in, understanding where you fit in with privilege, with accountability, with whom you're interacting, that's all significant. So even if you don't think of yourself as, I'm going to have a podcast all about being an activist or doing activism work, It is my belief that we have a responsibility to see how our work, whatever work that is, factors in. So I've talked about them before on the show, and That's Why We Drink is one of my favorite kind of escapism podcasts. But even they providing this reprieve of kind of being lighthearted and offering some good escapism are still very intentional about like, this is where we are, and these are resources that are accessible to you if you need them. So even if you are someone who kind of errs towards this isn't a political podcast, so I don't want to talk about politics, I want to give people an hour away from that each week, I do find that there is still so much value in just holding up a lantern and saying, we're going to be really silly right now to give you a break, but understand that I am also in this with you. I think that that's how you can approach kind of being an escapism show, but still upholding those values and helping to kind of be that light in the dark for people who need it. If you are a super duper niched down funnel podcast and this is all about your business, best to get your bag how you've got to. But for me, it is important that the work that I'm doing aligns with my values and that the people with which I am working are also people who see things in a similar way to me. Now, that's not to say that I have to agree with my clients on everything, that I need them to feel the exact same way, but that if we were to be diametrically opposed, it would be difficult for me to produce content for that person in good faith. So because of how I'm feeling, I'm very vocal about where I stand. And if I'm not the right professional for you, go with God, have a great day. I wish you the best. But the people with whom I choose to surround myself with, both personally and professionally, are people whose values align with mine. And, so that's kind of my stance on no matter what type of podcast you have, approaching it with just a little bit. It doesn't have to be episodes dedicated to the state of affairs or anything like that, but just having that little beacon of just like, I want to lay it on the table. This is where things are at. I think that that's important. Now, if you are someone who is new to the activism game, welcome. If you are a first generation progressive who's unpacking things, God love you, because that work is difficult and it's important. But there are a few things that I would like to say. As they say on TikTok, I'm going to hold your hand while I say this. And that's that there is a huge difference between activism and performative allyship. And every time that something that radicalizes people happens, we see this gray area of these two things happening. So the difference, if you're not familiar with activism versus performative activism or performative allyship, is who it truly impacts at the end of the day. So if you are someone who is not having the lived experience of the people you're trying to support, if you are trying to really radicalize for Black people and you are a white person, if you are trying to radicalize for queer people and you are cishet, there's a difference between actually showing up for that cause and just making it so that people think that you're one of the quote good ones. And we've seen a lot of discourse on TikTok recently about like the blue bracelet thing. And I have very cautiously tiptoed into my feelings on that because as a white person, I understand that I'm never fully going to get it. But I also understand the significance of marginalized groups having always had a secret language, a way to identify one another. And I think that there's value in that. So the pushback has been, I shouldn't have to have a bracelet for you to know that I'm doing the work. And where I gently and reservedly push back on that is like, okay, but if I'm in an airport with people who don't know whether or not I've tried to do the work and someone's feeling unsafe about using a bathroom that fits their gender, and they see some kind of visual representation on me, that immediately flags me as someone who can support them. It's kind of, to me, it's like almost a uniform that, if I'm at Target and I know that I need help, if I can readily identify somebody without having to go up and be like, hey, do you work for Target? Like, if I just can know, I see value in that. But I do think that too often, especially since social media, we see too many people who are content to just like post the blackout square on Instagram and then call it a day and say, see, I did the thing. I helped Black people today. And true activism does more than that. There's also a point to be raised about who are you benefiting with whatever it is you're doing in the sphere of activism. Are you doing it for clout? Are you doing it for engagement? Or do you genuinely want to support, uplift, and impact the communities with which you're speaking about? And this is especially relevant if it is not your community. Something else that comes up a lot in the discourse of activism versus performative activism or allyship is having skin in the game and being willing to lose something. And this can look like a lot of things. This can look like, are you willing to be arrested? Are you willing to lose money? Are you willing to lose followers? Are you willing to come into physical harm? What are you willing to sacrifice? Are you willing to lose relationships? If your answer is none of the above, reconsider the motive for why you want to do this work. If you are too scared to post something because you think that people won't like it and they'll unfollow you, ask yourself, do you really want those people following you? I mean, if that's really how you feel, that you really think that this is important, consider why that fear is outweighing your being vocal. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about if you are going to have guests within the lived experience or background of the cause that you're trying to support. And part of that goes back into the performative situation, but also part of it is just how do you navigate that when you are trying to benefit yourself? I mean, there's a huge part of it that you have to understand is like, you're coming on to my show, I'm going to get the views, I'm going to get the sponsorship opportunities, etc. But why do you want that person to come on? Do your research. Like I always talk about the planning phase. Before you even pitch for someone to be a guest, research and do some self-research. Like, what do you hope to get out of this? Because if you're just like, oh, this is a big deal, I should have a queer person on my show right now because it's trendy, that is going to miss the mark so hard. It's honestly already missed the mark. But if you want to go deeper and you're like, I want to talk to someone who's like a professor of like women's studies or gender studies or racial studies, do the research on what you want to ask them that's going to actually be impactful and go beyond the 101 level. Those people are asked and asked and asked the basic things. Do your research on what they like to present, what they like to talk about, and figure out how you can use that to appeal to your audience. Actually teach. And that's something that like is going to go beyond the performative sphere. Is like really get into the weeds and allow that person to talk about what it is that they're passionate about talking about. That's not just, this is what it's like to be a queer person. Or, these are the issues that queer people face, or insert any other demographic with which you're trying to support. But if you actually allow them to speak from their place of what drives them, you're going to get a better episode, but you're also going to go into a place that feels better for them. I talk about that a little bit to bring up asking for free emotional labor. If you're not familiar with the idea of emotional labor, it's basically when you're asking a person within a community that is marginalized or facing some kind of adversity, and you're like, well, teach me about it. Why can't I do this? Or why is this way? I talk so often on this show about being ungoogleable, and I really want to impress upon you that the people that you're having on your show are so tired of doing the Googleable work for anyone who they're educating. That they are sick and tired of giving you first page of Google answers. Allow them to go deeper. That is what is likely going to feel better for them. And that's likely where a lot of that authenticity is going to come for them as well. Think about how you're going to make it worth their time. Because if you're just like, hey, I want you to come on because you're Black to talk about Black stuff, that's not going to fly, like, at all. That's cringy, rude, and it's just going to feel phony. I mean, it's just going to feel like you are doing something because it's trendy, like you're doing something because you think you're supposed to. That if you really want to get somebody on your show who is, let's say, a person of color, a Black person, and you're like, talk to me about what it's like to be a Black obstetrician in Georgia. Like, that's going to be so much more engaging for them than to just like, oh, how does it feel to be a Black woman? Like, if you are just going surface level, or you're like, do you feel the impacts of racism? Like, yes, I promise you, without even knowing who this made up person is, yes, I promise you, she feels the effects of racism. But if you can get specific and be like, what adversity does an obstetrician in Georgia face because of your skin color? That's going to be so much more engaging and enjoyable for that person to speak on. And it's going to give richness to the content that you're producing as well. Something else that's going to keep you from getting stuck in that performative sphere is to go beyond awareness and start following through with concrete actions. And this is kind of going back to like that, do you have skin in the game? Because if you're just like, I'm going to educate, I'm going to proliferate information, that's not incredibly helpful to the realities of the causes that you're trying to uplift. That, you know, you need to be putting action into that. What does that look like? And it doesn't have to be that, you know, you are donating $1 million to the ACLU. It can literally be having those uncomfortable conversations at the Thanksgiving table with your uncle. That can be action, but so can hosting fundraisers. So can partnering and donating a portion of your podcasting profits. You know, there's a lot of different ways that you can take that next step, but just raising awareness, come on, we're beyond that. Like, it's time to really start having some action. And the part that a lot of people who are not within a community, and hell, even people who are, this is the part where things get uncomfortable, and it has to get uncomfortable. And that's to continuously be a lifelong learner, but also to be open to feedback. When you are operating in a public space like a podcast, there's always going to be feedback, and there's always going to be negative feedback, and there's always going to be 1-star reviews. But if you cannot gracefully and graciously accept criticism, and you're too afraid to make mistakes, that's not going to serve you, and that's not going to serve your cause. If you're going to be doing activism work with your podcast, understand that you're going to make mistakes, and get comfortable walking them back. Get comfortable not sweeping things under the rug, but going, you know what, 2 episodes ago, I misspoke. I have been educated. Thank you to the people who did the work to educate me. I have taken it another step, and I've learned and grown, and, you know, this is an opportunity for us to all learn, because maybe you also didn't know that this is not acceptable or kind or whatever the case may be. But if you're not able to graciously allow yourself to be wrong, you are doing surface level work. There is always going to be a way that you're going to get it wrong, and that's okay. And, you know, I think that this part also stops a lot of people who are afraid, because in this like current climate, people are so afraid of being canceled. And there's always going to be canceling. But I think what you do with that criticism is where the canceling can or cannot happen. So, like, let's take J.K. Rowling, for example. She says some hateful stuff on Twitter. People are like, hey, said some hateful stuff on Twitter. And she comes back and says, yep, I sure did, and doubles down and says, and I really mean it, hateful, hateful, hateful. There could have been a chance for her to salvage that reputation and salvage who she is to a lot of people if she said hateful stuff about trans people on Twitter. hey, that was not okay. Like, that's hurtful and that's inappropriate rhetoric. If she would have then come back and said, oh my gosh, you're so right. I have learned from my mistakes. I was uneducated. I didn't truly understand the gravity of what I was saying. Thank you for that. And then because I'm a big bucks billionaire, I'm contributing to trans people being able to access healthcare. That would have had such a different tone than just her continuing to be like black mold green goblin mask J.K. Rowling, right? Like that would have hit so different. So if you are afraid of being canceled, that's where I really, I led in with like, you have to be okay with walking things back, and you have to be humble enough to understand that you don't know everything, and humble enough to learn from the people who know more than you. And then as we start to wind down, I just want to talk a little bit more about collaborating effectively. Within this type of work, especially if you are not someone for whom this is a lived experience, make sure that you are amplifying without overshadowing. Focus on elevating the voices of those who are directly impacted by whatever your thing that you want to talk about or cause that you want to uplift is. This includes decentering yourself from the narrative, which is not something that white women like myself are traditionally great at doing. There is a lot of crying on TikTok happening. And trust me, I have done my fair share of crying in these last few weeks out of fear for myself as someone with a female reproductive system, as someone with a lot of really near and dear people accessing gender affirming care, as someone who is the mother of not only a little girl, but a little girl who is Black, and fearing for the world that she's going to grow up in, fearing for my husband, who is a Black man who is also in the military, and, having some fears about things being volatile in foreign affairs. But, I am also feeling a lot of those big feelings. But the significance is to reframe what is actually happening to me and what hurt I am feeling out of empathy. And to say, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. When what I really mean is that I am so afraid for the people who I love who are people of color, the people who I love who are in queer relationships, the people who I love who are transgender, the people who I love who are medically fragile and at risk of losing healthcare, the people who I love who are trying to start a family. Those people are all going to be hit long before me. And so my tears are not as valuable as my action. I say that so gently because there is space for your big emotions. But where it becomes misguided is when that is the bulk of what you're sharing. When really it is our responsibility as people who are further away from the rising tide of this impact. We need to be the ones using the privilege that we have just by being born into the circumstances we are. It is our responsibility and our obligation. All done? I love you. All right. I'm almost done. I think I'm going to leave that in just on purpose. It is our responsibility to show up and to be brave enough to even briefly entertain what it would be like to be people closer to the water's edge. That when we occupy that space of having those big emotions, of needing to be comforted, that takes away from the actual chance for impact. That right now, we need to be doing the emotional labor. We need to be the ones showing up. That's it for today. Thank you for having me back. Thank you for being here. Thank you for continuing to show up and for using your voice to make a difference. I will be back next week, and we're going to continue having conversations like this, and we're going to continue talking about making change. We're going to continue to talk about making amazing podcasts. I do that also over at Sonivia Studios on Instagram. You can come hang out with me there. But until next time, thank you for helping me take podcasting up an octave.
Mama.
Mm-hmm.
Mama.
What do you want to say?
Yeah.
Ollie, you want to say bye?
Yeah. Bye.